Hello Year 10s, welcome to this video on Parliament, which is intended to give you an overview of the structure and roles of both the Commonwealth Parliament and the Victorian Parliament. There are three things that you need to do while you're watching this video. The first thing is to take the very best Cornell notes that you can. The second thing is to use the pause and rewind functions. Use the pause function if you need to stop this video to give yourself time to take some notes. Use the rewind function if you feel that you've missed out on any information and you want to go back over that information. The third thing that you need to do is have your vocabulary sheets open in front of you so that you can write into your vocabulary sheets the definitions of any important terms referred to in this video or the meaning of any other words that you may not be familiar with. Well, let's get started then. Here's your learning intention. Make sure that you write these learning intentions in your Cornell notes. The first learning intention is that you need to be able to describe the structure of the Commonwealth Parliament and the Victorian Parliament. The second learning intention is that you need to be able to describe the roles of the two houses in the Commonwealth Parliament and the Victorian Parliament. There are two levels of Parliament in Australia. The Commonwealth Parliament is Australia's national parliament. It makes laws for the whole of Australia. The Commonwealth Parliament is located in Canberra, which is the capital of Australia. However, you should also know that Australia is divided into 6 states and 2 territories. These 6 states are Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia and Tasmania. The 2 territories are the Australian Capital Territory, or the ACT, which is where Canberra is located, and the Northern Territory. Each state and territory has their own parliament which makes laws for that state or territory. So, for example, in Victoria we have the Victorian Parliament which makes laws for Victoria. We'll start off by looking at the Commonwealth Parliament. The Commonwealth Parliament consists of the Crown, the House of Representatives, which is the lower house in the Commonwealth Parliament, and the Senate, which is the upper house in the Commonwealth Parliament. The Crown refers to the King or Queen of England. The King or Queen of England is Australia's head of state. Currently, our head of state is Queen Elizabeth II. Now, Queen Elizabeth lives in England, but she has a representative in Australia. That representative at the federal or Commonwealth level is the Governor-General. Our current Governor-General is Sir David Hurley. In addition to the Crown, the Commonwealth Parliament consists of 2 houses. These are the House of Representatives and the Senate. As I've said, the House of Representatives is the lower house in the Commonwealth Parliament, and the Senate is the upper house in the Commonwealth Parliament. Now, just because the House of Representatives is the lower house and the Senate is the upper house, doesn't mean that the Senate in some way controls the House of Representatives, or that the House of Representatives is less powerful or less important than the Senate. On the contrary, to pass a law, both the House of Representatives and the Senate must vote in favour of that law. So in this sense at least, these 2 houses of Parliament are equally powerful. The House of Representatives, that is the lower house in the Commonwealth Parliament, has 151 members. This is because Australia is divided into 151 electorates or districts. And the voters in each electorate elect 1 member of the House of Representatives to represent that electorate. On the other hand, the Senate has 76 members. As I've said, Australia consists of 6 states and 2 territories. The voters in each state elect 12 senators for that state. The voters in each territory elect 2 senators for that territory. Because there are 6 states, this means that there are 6 times 12, that is 72 senators elected for the states. Because there are 2 territories, this means that there are 2 times 2, that is 4 senators elected for the territories. Elections for the House of Representatives are held at least every 3 years. However, it's a different situation in the Senate. In the case of the Senate, there is a half Senate election every 3 years. This means that every 3 years, half of the Senate, that is, 38 senators, are up for election. But once a senator has been elected, that senator serves a 6-year term. So, for example, in 2006, 38 out of the 76 senators faced an election. Those senators who were elected in 2006 served a 6-year term, and so they only faced another election in 2012. But in 2009, the remaining 38 senators faced an election. Those senators who were elected in 2009 served a 6-year term, and so they only faced their next election in 2015. The House of Representatives is also called the House of Government and the People's House. And the Senate is also known as the House of Review and the States House. We'll be looking at what each of these terms means in a little while. This slide shows you the 151 electorates that Australia is divided into. As I've said, the voters in each of these electorates or districts elect one member to the House of Representatives to represent that electorate. Our electorate is called Maribyrnong. At the last election, the majority of the voters in Maribyrnong elected Bill Shorten to represent them in the House of Representatives, and so Bill Shorten is known as the member for Maribyrnong. And here we have a picture of Australia divided into its 6 states and 2 territories. Again, as I've said, each of the 6 states elects 12 senators to represent that state in the Senate, and each of the 2 territories elects 2 senators to represent that territory in the Senate. Most of you will have heard of the Commonwealth Government, which is also known as the federal government. It's very important not to confuse the Commonwealth Government with the Commonwealth Parliament. Here we come to the first definition that you need to include in your vocabulary sheets. Look down the left-hand side, find the term government, and write the following in there. The party or coalition of parties that has the highest number of elected members in the lower house forms the government. The members of Parliament who belong to this party make up the government. So, for example, at the last election for the House of Representatives, which was held in 2019, the Liberal National Party coalition won the most number of seats in the lower house, that is, in the House of Representatives. In fact, they won 77 of the 151 seats, which is a little over half of the seats in the House of Representatives. Put another way, the Liberal National Party coalition had the highest number of elected members in the House of Representatives. This meant that the Liberal National Party coalition formed the Commonwealth Government. The Prime Minister is the person who is the leader of the party that wins government. So this brings us to our next definition that you need to include in your vocabulary sheets. Look down the left-hand side, find Prime Minister, and write in there that the Prime Minister is the leader of the federal government. Currently our Prime Minister is Scott Morrison, who is the leader of the Liberal National Party coalition. Now, the Prime Minister can't govern Australia alone. The job is too big for one person. So the Prime Minister appoints other members of the party that's won government to help him or her. These people are called ministers. Here we come to yet another definition to include in your vocabulary sheets. Look down the left-hand side and find the term minister, and write this definition in there. At the federal level, a minister is a member of Parliament and of the government who is appointed by the Prime Minister to administer a government department. I've given you 4 examples of ministers in the current government. These are Josh Frydenberg, who's the Treasurer, Senator Maurice Payne, who's the Foreign Minister, Darren Chester, who's the Minister for Veteran Affairs, and Ken Wyatt, who's the Minister for Indigenous Australians. You can see that the ministers can come from both the House of Representatives and the Senate. The important thing is that these people are all members of the party that won the highest number of seats in the House of Representatives, that is, in the lower house. Now, some ministers are more important than others because they're given greater responsibilities. Two of the most important ministers in the government, besides the Prime Minister, are the Treasurer, who looks after Australia's money, and the Foreign Minister, who looks after Australia's relationship with other countries. These are just two examples of senior ministers. The Prime Minister and the more senior ministers make up what we call the Cabinet. And again, we have another definition for you. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets and find the word Cabinet. And opposite that term, write the following. At the federal level, Cabinet is the Prime Minister and the senior ministers chosen by the Prime Minister. Now, Cabinet is a very important body because it is the body, that is, it is the group of people that decides the government's policies. There are other members of the Commonwealth Government, that is, people who belong to the party that's won the most seats in the House of Representatives and who have been elected to the Commonwealth Parliament, either elected to the House of Representatives or to the Senate. But these people have not been made ministers. Here are some examples. Andrew Laming and Kevin Andrews. They are members of the Liberal National Party coalition government, but they are not ministers. They haven't been appointed by the Prime Minister to be responsible for a government department. We call these people government backbenchers. As I've said, the Liberal National Party coalition is currently Australia's government. But there are also members of the Labor Party, the Greens, Centre Alliance, One Nation, Katter's Australian Party, the Australian Conservatives and the Jackie Lambie Network who have been elected to the Commonwealth Parliament. This brings us to our next important definition, which is the definition of opposition. Look down at the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the term opposition and write this definition in there. The opposition is the party or coalition of parties that has the second highest number of elected members in the lower house. Now, after the 2019 election, the party that had the second highest number of elected members in the House of Representatives was Labor. So, currently, the opposition at the federal level is the Labor Party. The opposition leader is the leader of the federal opposition. So there again you have a definition that you need to write in your vocabulary sheets. Look down the left-hand side for opposition leader and write in there the definition leader of the federal opposition. Currently, the leader of the federal opposition is Anthony Albanese because he is the leader of the Labor Party, which is the opposition party in the Commonwealth Parliament. Now, just like the Prime Minister, the leader of the opposition needs people to help him or her. So the leader of the opposition appoints shadow ministers. And here's another important definition for you. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the term shadow minister, and write in there that a shadow minister is a member of Parliament and of the opposition who is appointed by the leader of the opposition to keep a check on, that is to shadow, a government minister. So Mr Albanese has appointed a number of members of his party, drawn from the House of Representatives and also from the Senate, and he's appointed those people to be shadow ministers. Now, some of those ministers, those shadow ministers, are more senior than others, and again, those more senior members, together with the leader of the opposition, make up the shadow cabinet. Well, there are also some members of the opposition, that is members of the Labor Party, who have been elected to the Commonwealth Parliament, either in the House of Representatives or in the Senate, and who have not been appointed as shadow ministers. These people are called opposition backbenchers. Well, that's enough about the Commonwealth Parliament for the time being. Let's now look at the Victorian Parliament. The Victorian Parliament consists of the Crown, the Legislative Assembly, which is the lower house in the Victorian Parliament, and the Legislative Council, which is the upper house in the Victorian Parliament. Yet again, the Crown refers to the King or Queen of England. The King or Queen of England is Victoria's head of state. Currently, Victoria's head of state is therefore Queen Elizabeth II. Now, as we've said before, Queen Elizabeth lives in England, but she has a representative in Victoria. That representative is the Governor, and the current Governor of Victoria is Linda Dessau. In addition to the Crown, the Victorian Parliament consists of two houses. There is the Legislative Assembly and there is the Legislative Council. The Legislative Assembly is the lower house in the Victorian Parliament and the Legislative Council is the upper house in the Victorian Parliament. As with the Commonwealth Parliament, the fact that the Legislative Assembly is the lower house and the Legislative Council is the upper house doesn't mean that the Legislative Council in any way controls the Legislative Assembly or that the Legislative Assembly is any less powerful or less important than the Legislative Council. On the contrary, to pass a law, both the Legislative Assembly and the Legislative Council have to vote in favour of that law. And so that demonstrates that these two houses of the Victorian Parliament are at least equally powerful. The Legislative Assembly, that is, the lower house in the Victorian Parliament, has 88 members. And this is because Victoria is divided into 88 electoral districts, and the voters in each electoral district elect one member of the Legislative Assembly to represent that electoral district. On the other hand, the Legislative Council consists of 40 members, and this is because Victoria is also divided into 8 regions, and the voters in each region elect 5 members of the Legislative Council to represent that region. Elections for the Legislative Assembly are held every 4 years at the same time as elections for the Legislative Council. And that also means that elections for the Legislative Council are held every 4 years, which is at the same time as elections for the Legislative Assembly. Putting that in simpler terms, elections for both the Legislative Assembly and the Legislative Council are held every 4 years at the same time, and that is always on the last Saturday in November. Other names for the Legislative Assembly are the House of Government and the People's House, and the Legislative Council is also known as the House of Review. In this regard, it's a bit different from the Senate. You recall that the Senate is called not just the House of Review, but it's also called the States House. Well, in the case of the Legislative Council, because that's part of the Victorian Parliament, that is, it's within one state, we don't call the Legislative Council the States House. This slide shows you the 88 electoral districts that Victoria is divided into. As I've said, the voters in each of these electoral districts elect one member to the Legislative Assembly to represent that electoral district. Our electoral district is called St Albans. At the last Victorian election, the majority of voters in St Albans elected Natalie Suleiman to represent them in the Legislative Assembly, and so Natalie Suleiman is known as the member for St Albans. And here we have a picture of Victoria, which has been divided into the 8 electoral regions. You recall that what I said was that each of these electoral regions elects 5 members to the Legislative Council. Again, it's very important not to confuse the Victorian Government with the Victorian Parliament. On this slide, I've included in the top left-hand corner the definition of government that you should already have written in your vocabulary sheets. That definition reads, the party or coalition of parties that has the highest number of elected members in the lower house forms the government. The members of Parliament who belong to this party make up the government. Now, the lower house in the Victorian Parliament is the Legislative Assembly. So, it is the party or coalition of parties that has the highest number of elected members in the Legislative Assembly that will form the Victorian government. At the last election for the Legislative Assembly, which was held in 2018, the Labor Party won 55 out of the 88 seats in the Legislative Assembly. Put another way, the Labor Party had the highest number of elected members in the Legislative Assembly, and this meant that the Labor Party formed the Victorian government. A Premier is the leader of a state government. That is, they are the leader of the party that wins government for a particular state. In the case of Victoria, our Premier is Daniel Andrews, and that's because he's the leader of the Labor Party, which is the party that forms government in Victoria. It won the highest number of seats in the Legislative Assembly at the last election. So here's another definition for your vocabulary sheets. Look down the left-hand side, find the word Premier, and write in there, leader of a state government. Now, Daniel Andrews can't govern Victoria just by himself. He needs some help, so he's appointed other members of his party to help him govern Victoria. These people are called ministers, and we've already come across the definition of ministers at the federal level, where we said that at the federal level, a minister is a member of Parliament and of the government who's appointed by the Prime Minister to administer a government department. Well, I want you to find the term minister in your vocabulary sheet again, and this time I want you to add to that definition that at the state level, a minister is a member of Parliament and of the government who is appointed by the Premier to administer a government department. And Daniel Andrews has appointed a number of ministers. Now, some of those ministers are senior ministers. That is, they are ministers who have been given particularly important responsibilities. So, for example, in Victoria, we have the Minister for Health, who's responsible for Victoria's hospitals. We have the Minister for Education, who's responsible for Victoria's school system. And we have the Treasurer, who is responsible for looking after Victoria's money. These are all senior ministers, and together with the Premier, they make up the Cabinet. Now again, we've defined Cabinet before at the federal level. We said that at the federal level, the Cabinet is the Prime Minister and the senior ministers chosen by the Prime Minister. Well, I want you to find the definition of Cabinet in your vocabulary sheets and now add to that definition. And what I want you to add is the following. At the state level, the Cabinet is the Premier and the senior ministers chosen by the Premier. Now, just as is the case with the Cabinet in the Commonwealth Government, the Victorian Cabinet is very important because it is the body, the group of people, that decides the Victorian Government's policies. There are also members of the government who haven't been appointed as ministers by the Premier, and these are called government backbenchers. So, the Labor Party is currently Victoria's government, but there are a number of members of the Liberal Party, the National Party, the Greens, the Justice Party, the Liberal Democrats, the Animal Justice Party, the Reason Party, the Shooters and Fishers Party, the Sustainable Australia Party, and the Transport Matters Party, who have been elected to the Victorian Parliament. We've already looked at the definition of opposition, and you should have included that in your vocabulary sheet. The opposition is the party or coalition of parties that has the second highest number of elected members in the lower house. In the case of Victoria, it is the Liberal National Party coalition that has the second highest number of elected members in the Legislative Assembly, which is the lower house in the Victorian Parliament. And therefore we say the Liberal National Party coalition is the Victorian opposition. The opposition leader is the leader of the opposition. In the case of Victoria, the leader of the Victorian opposition is Michael O'Brien, because he's the leader of the Liberal National Party coalition. Michael O'Brien has appointed a number of shadow ministers, and again you've seen this definition before. A shadow minister is a member of Parliament and of the opposition who's appointed by the leader of the opposition to keep a check on, that is to shadow, a government minister. So Michael O'Brien has appointed a number of these shadow ministers to help him in his job as leader of the opposition. Some of those shadow ministers have been given more important responsibilities. For example, we have the shadow treasurer, who's responsible for keeping a check on the Victorian treasurer. The shadow minister for education, who's responsible for keeping a check on the Victorian minister for education. The shadow minister for health, who's responsible for keeping a check on the Victorian minister for health. And these more senior shadow ministers make up the shadow cabinet. Of course, there are also other members of the Victorian opposition. They've been elected to the Victorian Parliament, either in the Legislative Assembly or the Legislative Council, but they have not been appointed as shadow ministers. These people are called opposition backbenchers. This slide shows you the seating plan for a House of Parliament. It could be the House of Representatives or the Senate in the Commonwealth Parliament, or the Legislative Assembly or the Legislative Council in the Victorian Parliament. A person called the Speaker sits up at the front of the House. The Speaker is a member of that House who has been elected by the other members of the House to control proceedings in that House. So, for example, it's the Speaker who decides when a member of the House can speak, and it's the Speaker who can throw out a member of that House where that member misbehaves. The government members of the House sit to the right of the Speaker, and the opposition members of that House sit to the left of the Speaker. Ministers sit in the front row of the government benches, and shadow ministers sit in the front row of the opposition benches. Behind the ministers we have the government backbenches, and behind the shadow ministers we have the opposition backbenches. And this brings us to another very important definition to include in your vocabulary sheets, which is the definition of backbencher. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the term backbencher, and write in the following definition. A backbencher is a member of the government or opposition who is not a minister or shadow minister. And finally, we have some other members of Parliament who are not members of either the government or the opposition. Some of you may have heard of Pauline Hanson. She is actually a member of the Senate in the Commonwealth Parliament, but she's not a member of either the Liberal National Party coalition government or the Labor opposition. Instead, she's a member of a party called One Nation. She's also the leader of One Nation. She is called a crossbencher. And here's another definition to include in your vocabulary sheets. Look down the left-hand side, find the term crossbencher, and write in the following definition. A crossbencher is a member of Parliament who is not a member of either the government or the opposition. Using all of the information that I've given you so far, we're now in a position to describe the Australian parliamentary system. If you're ever asked to describe the Australian parliamentary system, you can do this by describing the three very important features of it. The first feature is that Australia is a federation. A federation is a system of government where a national parliament makes laws for the whole country and separate state parliaments make laws for each state. In your vocabulary sheets, find the term federation and write that definition in there. We say that Australia is a federation because it has a national parliament, that is the Commonwealth Parliament, which makes laws for the whole of Australia. and separate state parliaments, such as the Victorian Parliament, which make laws for their own state. The second feature is that both the Commonwealth Parliament and the Victorian Parliament are bicameral. A bicameral parliament is a parliament that is made up of two houses of parliament, that is, an upper house and a lower house. In your vocabulary sheets, find the term bicameral and write that definition in there. We say that the Commonwealth Parliament is bicameral because it's made up of an upper house, the Senate, and a lower house, the House of Representatives. We say that the Victorian Parliament is bicameral because it's made up of an upper house, the Legislative Council, and a lower house, the Legislative Assembly. In fact, most of the state parliaments in Australia are bicameral. The exception is the Queensland Parliament, which is unicameral. That is, the Queensland Parliament only consists of one house. The third feature is that Australia is a constitutional monarchy. A constitutional monarchy is a system of government where a monarch, that is a sovereign such as a king or a queen, is the head of state, but that monarch can only exercise their powers in accordance with a constitution. In your vocabulary sheets, find the term constitutional monarchy and write that definition in there. We say that Australia is a constitutional monarchy because the King or Queen of England, currently Queen Elizabeth II, is the head of state of Australia, but her powers are limited by the Australian Constitution. The Australian Constitution is a very important piece of legislation. It is the legislation that sets out what the powers of the Commonwealth Parliament, the Commonwealth Government, and the courts are. The Australian Constitution makes it very clear that only the Commonwealth Parliament can make laws for Australia. Now, hundreds of years ago, the King or Queen could have made laws by themselves. However, our Australian Constitution says that it is the Commonwealth Parliament and not the King or Queen, not the monarch, who can make laws for Australia. In fact, our Constitution gives very little real power to the King or Queen or their representative in Australia, which is the Governor-General. We're nearly there, just 4 more slides to go, and these slides describe the roles of each of the Houses of Parliament, which is our second learning intention. You might remember that we said that the House of Representatives, which is the lower house in the Commonwealth Parliament, and the Legislative Assembly, which is the lower house in the Victorian Parliament, are also known as the House of Government. The reason for this is, as we've seen, that it is the party or coalition of parties that has the highest number of elected members in the lower house that forms the government. So the House of Representatives and the Legislative Assembly are called the House of Government because the party which has the most seats in that house is the party that makes up the government. In your vocabulary sheets, find the term House of Government and write this definition in there. You might also remember that we said that another name for the House of Representatives and the Legislative Assembly is the People's House. This is because members of these houses are directly elected by the voters who live in the area that those members represent. As we've said, Australia is divided up into 151 electorates, and the voters in each electorate choose one person who will represent that electorate in the House of Representatives. Similarly, Victoria is divided up into 88 electoral districts, and the voters in each electoral district choose one person who will represent that electoral district in the Legislative Assembly. Make sure that you write the definition of People's House in your vocabulary list opposite the term People's House in the left-hand side. Another name for both the Senate and the Legislative Council is the House of Review. As we'll see in a later video, bills, that is proposed laws, are generally introduced into the lower house where they are passed, and then those bills are sent to the upper house. In these circumstances, The role of the upper house is to decide whether to pass, amend, or reject bills that have been passed by the lower house. That is, the role of the upper house is to review those bills. And it's for that reason that we call the Senate, as the upper house in the Commonwealth Parliament, and the Legislative Council, as the upper house in the Victorian Parliament, a House of Review. In your vocabulary sheets, find the term House of Review and write this definition in there. Finally, another name for the Senate is the States House. This is because each state is represented in the Senate by an equal number of senators, that is, 12 senators. This is different from the House of Representatives. The more populous states, such as Victoria and New South Wales, have a larger number of electorates. And that's because electorates are constructed so that they contain roughly equal numbers of voters. Because Victoria and New South Wales have much larger numbers of voters, they have more electorates. As a consequence, there is a greater number of members of the House of Representatives from, say, Victoria than from, say, South Australia. When our parliamentary system was set up, the less populous states, such as South Australia, were concerned that the more populous states, such as Victoria, would be able to control the Commonwealth Parliament. The purpose of establishing the Senate was to establish a House of Parliament that was controlled equally by all of the states. So, even if the House of Representatives passed legislation that was supported by the more populous states and opposed by the less populous states, that legislation could still be rejected in the Senate, where each state had an equal number of votes, because each state was represented by 12 senators. In your vocabulary sheets, find the term States House and write this definition in there. Remember, though, that we do not describe the Legislative Council, that is the upper house in the Victorian Parliament, as a States House. And this is because the Legislative Council is part of the Victorian Parliament, that is, it is part of the Parliament of one state, so we can't describe it as a States House. Well, that brings us to the end of this video. You should now be able to do two things. The first thing is that you should be able to describe the structure of the Commonwealth Parliament and the Victorian Parliament. The second thing is that you should be able to describe the roles of the two houses in the Commonwealth Parliament and the Victorian Parliament. Thank you very much for your attention.